You're standing in the kitchen or perhaps sitting at your desk and someone asks you for a favor. It's a small thing, really. But inside, you feel that familiar tightening in your chest. You already have too much on your plate. You want to say no. But instead of the word no, you hear yourself saying, "Sure, I can handle that." In that moment, the immediate tension drops, but it's replaced by a different kind of weight, the weight of exhaustion, a touch of resentment. Why's in that lingering question? Why is it so hard for me to just say what I need? You are not being difficult. You might feel like you're failing somehow, or that other people find this effortless while you struggle, but there is a much deeper, more protective reason for this difficulty, and understanding it changes how you see yourself in these moments. The part nobody talks about. First, before we get into the mechanics of boundaries, there's something more important to address. Yet the discomfort you feel in these moments is not a character flaw. It's not evidence that you're weak, overly sensitive, or behind where you should be. For many people, the struggle around boundary conversations is directly tied to how the nervous system responds to social situations, particularly ones that carry any possibility of conflict or disapproval. That connection matters more than most boundary advice ever acknowledges. While most content on this topic skips straight to communication tactics, what to say, how to say it, which phrases to use. And while communication does matter, the language is almost never the missing piece. What's more useful is understanding what's actually happening before the conversation begins, why your brain treats this like a threat. To understand why boundaries feel so difficult, you have to look at how the brain monitors safety, and the answer goes back much further than your current relationships. For most of human history, being part of a group wasn't just a social preference. It was a survival necessity. Being cast out, rejected, or in sustained conflict with the people around you carried real consequences. Because of this, the brain developed an extraordinarily sensitive radar for social friction. But when you consider setting a boundary, telling a coworker you can't take on their project, telling a family member you won't be able to make it this weekend, your brain's safety monitoring system can interpret that potential conflict as a genuine threat. Not a physical one, but a social one. And to the nervous system, the distinction isn't always as clear as you might expect. This can trigger a subtle but real stress response. Your heart rate may climb slightly, but your breathing becomes shallower. Your attention narrows and begins scanning the other person's face for signs of annoyance or disappointment. Your nervous system is trying to protect you. It's trying to keep you safe by keeping you compliant. In that activated state, saying yes feels like the fastest route back to safety, even if it leaves you feeling depleted for the rest of the day. The loop most people don't notice. When this pattern repeats over time without much examination, it tends to settle into a predictable cycle. A situation arises that calls for a boundary. Before you've even responded, your mind moves to anticipation, running through possible reactions, imagining the worst, weighing the social cost of saying no. That anticipation activates a stress response. Tension rises. And the fastest way to relieve that tension is to accommodate, to soften, to agree to something you didn't actually want to do. For a few minutes, there's relief. Yeah, the conflict has been avoided, the discomfort lifts, but that relief is essentially a loan taken out against your future energy. You've borrowed calm now and agreed to pay it back later, in the form of exhaustion, quiet resentment, or a growing sense that your time and energy are not really your own. Over time, the cycle doesn't just repeat, it tends to deepen. Each time it completes, the nervous system learns that accommodation is the correct response to social tension, and the pattern becomes more automatic, not less. This is not a personality flaw. It's an automated response built from repeated experience. You aren't bad at boundaries. You are currently operating within a nervous system that has learned to prioritize immediate social peace over long-term personal sustainability. What's actually being practiced? There's a tendency to think of people who set boundaries easily as simply more confident or more naturally assertive, as if they were born with a trait you somehow missed. But most people who navigate these conversations with relative ease still feel some degree of discomfort in the harder ones. The difference isn't the absence of the stress response. It's that they've had enough practice working alongside it that the discomfort no longer functions as a stop sign. That's a meaningful distinction. It means this isn't about personality. It's about familiarity, repetition, and, importantly, regulation. At the hidden cost of staying in the loop. Here's something that tends to get overlooked entirely. While avoiding a difficult conversation reduces stress in the short term, it often increases the overall stress load over time. This is the part of the equation that most people aren't tracking. When you live without defined limits, the nervous system tends to stay in a state of ongoing social vigilance. Because it hasn't been given clear signals about where your capacity ends, as it remains alert, constantly scanning for others' needs, monitoring for potential friction, bracing for the conversation that hasn't happened yet. That sustained vigilance carries a cost. It keeps a low-level stress response running in the background even when nothing dramatic is happening. And over time, that accumulation takes a toll that's easy to misattribute, blaming general fatigue or a difficult season or just your personality, when the underlying driver is a nervous system that hasn't been given permission to fully settle. By consistently avoiding the boundary conversation, you are inadvertently signaling to your brain that the world is a place where you are always at risk of being overwhelmed. The very thing meant to protect you from stress ends up sustaining it. Regulation before communication. So how do you move forward? Without the external drama with other people, and without the internal drama of guilt and second-guessing? It begins with regulation, not communication tactics. You cannot have a grounded, clear conversation while your nervous system is in a state of high activation. The words may be technically correct, but the delivery will often come out sharper, more collapsed, or more defensive than you intended. The quality of a difficult conversation is heavily influenced by the internal state you bring into it. While one principle worth working with is emotional pacing. You don't have to respond immediately, giving yourself even a few minutes, stepping away from the conversation, taking a breath, letting the initial activation settle, creates a wider margin to work from. The timing of when a boundary is communicated often matters as much as what is said. Another principle is preparation, for conversations you know are coming. Yet approaching them from a settled state rather than a reactive one changes the dynamic significantly. Some people find it helpful to use guided reflection tools to work through what they want to say beforehand. Others use intentional breathing exercises as a way of signaling safety to the nervous system before walking into a difficult exchange. These aren't techniques to follow perfectly. They're conditions to experiment with. The goal is simply to shift your internal state so that the conversation feels less like a survival situation and more like a straightforward exchange of information. Environment plays a role too. Factors like fatigue, time of day, and physical space influence how regulated you are going into a conversation. Some people find that small environmental adjustments, a consistent sleep routine, reduced stimulation before a hard conversation, or tools that support their baseline regulation over time, make the work meaningfully easier, not because they solve the underlying dynamic, but because they make a steadier internal state more accessible. The nuance, that quick advice, skips. It's also worth being honest about something that most boundary content glosses over. Boundaries don't function the same way in every relationship. What feels relatively clear and low stakes to communicate with a coworker may feel far more layered with a parent, a close friend, or a long-term partner. The emotional history is different. The nervous system's response is often different too. When a pattern in a relationship shifts, when someone who has typically said yes begins saying no, there can be a period of friction before things recalibrate. The other person may need time to adjust. But that friction isn't necessarily a sign the boundary was wrong. It's often just part of how relationships adjust to new information about what someone needs. Some relationships will adapt quickly, others will take longer, and some dynamics, particularly those with significant history or recurring conflict, are genuinely complex, and navigating them well sometimes requires outside support. Working with a therapist or counselor in those situations isn't a failure, and it's a proportionate response to a genuinely difficult challenge. Setting boundaries is not about building walls to keep people out. It's about building clear enough communication that your relationships can actually be sustainable for both people in them. When you begin to define your limits, you are doing something quiet but significant. You are teaching your nervous system that you are capable of protecting yourself. You are gradually moving from a reactive, vigilance-based way of operating to something more grounded. It won't feel seamless the first time. There will probably still be a flutter of discomfort, a moment of guilt, a second guessing of whether you said it right. That's not evidence that you've failed. Those are signals from a system that is in the process of learning, and learning takes repetition. Boundary setting is a communication skill. Like any skill, it develops through practice, through small adjustments, through learning what works across different relationships and contexts. There isn't a threshold you cross where it suddenly becomes effortless for everyone. But it does become more familiar, and familiarity over time starts to feel a lot like ease. Your nervous system is trying to protect you. That has always been true. Understanding that protection, rather than fighting it, is usually where the shift begins. Be patient with the process. Regulation is gradual, not instant. And gradual, now in this case, is exactly how it's supposed to work. This video is educational in nature and is focused on understanding stress responses and communication patterns. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. If stress or anxiety feels persistent or significantly affects your daily life, speaking with a qualified professional is a helpful next step.